Sarah Martinez had been looking forward to this vacation for months. After working double shifts as a nurse in downtown San, she desperately needed the peace that only the ocean could provide. The small coastal town of Oceanside seemed perfect for a solo retreat. She had booked a modest beachfront cottage for a week, planning to spend her days reading, walking along the shore, and finally getting some rest. The morning sun painted the Pacific in brilliant shades of gold as Sarah made her way down to the beach. She wore a simple sundress and carried a canvas bag filled with sunscreen, a water bottle, and the novel she had been trying to finish for weeks. The sand felt warm beneath her bare feet, and the sound of waves immediately began to wash away the stress she had been carrying. Sarah found a quiet spot away from the main beach area where families with children typically gathered. She spread out her towel and settled in with her book. The gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed, and for the first time in months, she felt truly relaxed. About an hour into her peaceful morning, Sarah noticed a man approaching from down the beach. He appeared to be in his 30s, muscular build, with an aggressive swagger that immediately put her on edge. Something about his demeanor made her uncomfortable, but she tried to focus on her book, hoping he would simply walk past. The man, later identified as a local troublemaker with a history of harassing women on the beach, had been drinking since early morning. He had noticed Sarah from his position near the pier and decided she looked like an easy target. Had a pattern of approaching lone women on the beach, making inappropriate comments, and becoming increasingly aggressive if they ignored him. As got closer, Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath. He stopped directly in front of her towel, blocking her view of the ocean and casting a shadow over her book. His bloodshot eyes and unsteady stance confirmed her worst fears about his intentions. "Hey there, beautiful," slurred, his voice carrying a threatening undertone. "What's a pretty girl like you doing all alone out here? Don't you know it's dangerous?" Sarah looked up from her book, trying to remain calm. "I'm just trying to read and enjoy the beach," she said politely but firmly. "Please leave me alone." His expression darkened at her rejection. He had expected her to be flattered by his attention, and her dismissal only fueled his anger. "That's not very friendly," he said, taking a step closer. "I was just trying to be nice. Maybe you need someone to teach you some manners." Sarah's heart began to race. She could see that reasoning with this man would be impossible in his current state. She started to gather her things, hopping to leave the area quickly and safely. "I think I'll head back to my hotel now," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But had no intention of letting her leave. As Sarah stood up and reached for her bag, he grabbed her wrist roughly. "I don't think so, sweetheart," he said, his grip tightening. "You're going to sit back down and have a conversation with me whether you like it or not." The pain in Sarah's wrist was immediate and sharp. She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "Let go of me," she said, her voice rising with panic. "You're hurting me." Seemed to enjoy her fear. "Maybe I am," he said with a cruel smile. "Maybe that'll teach you to be more respectful when a man is talking to you." Sarah looked around desperately for help, but the beach was relatively empty at this hour. A few joggers were visible in the distance, but they were too far away to notice her distress. She realized she would have to rely on herself to get out of this situation. "Please," she said, trying a different approach. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me go and I'll leave you alone." His response was to twist her wrist painfully. "You should have thought about that before you decided to be rude to me," he said. "Now you're going to make it up to me one way or another." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a wave of terror wash over her. She could see the rage building in his eyes, and she knew that her situation was about to become much worse. The isolated beach that had seemed so peaceful just moments before now felt like a trap. As began to pull her toward a more secluded area behind some rocks, Sarah realized she had to act fast. She tried to dig her heels into the sand, but his strength was overwhelming. The sound of the waves that had been so comforting now seemed to mock her, drowning out any cries for help she might make. His free hand moved toward her face in what was clearly preparation for a strike. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had done this before, someone who enjoyed the power he held over another person. Sarah closed her eyes and braced herself for the blow, knowing that once it came, her situation would become even more desperate. In that terrifying moment, with his hand raised and ready to strike, Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to fight back, but he was much stronger. She could scream, but the beach was too empty for anyone to hear. She felt completely helpless, trapped by this man's violence and the isolated location she had chosen for its peace and quiet. The irony was not lost on her that the very solitude she had sought for healing had now become the thing that put her in the greatest danger. As hand began its downward arc toward her face, Sarah prepared herself for the worst, unaware that help was much closer than she could have imagined. Lieutenant Commander Jake had been leading SEAL team training exercises for over 8 years, but this particular morning drill was special. His team of 6 elite Navy SEALs was conducting an advanced beach reconnaissance mission as part of their preparation for an upcoming deployment. The exercise was designed to test their stealth capabilities, communication skills, and ability to move undetected through civilian areas. The team had been inserted into the water before dawn, swimming underwater for nearly 2 miles before reaching the oceanside coastline. Their mission was simple in concept but complex in execution. Infiltrate the beach area, gather intelligence on simulated enemy positions, and extract without being detected by the enemy forces or civilians in the area. Petty Officer First Class was the team's point man, responsible for leading the initial reconnaissance. Behind him moved Petty Officer Second Class David, the communications specialist, followed by Hospital Corpsman Second Class Tommy Williams, their medic. The remaining team members, including Petty Officer First Class Alex and Petty Officer Second Class Foster, maintained overwatch positions while Petty Officer First Class Carlos handled rear security. The SEALs had emerged from the water in the pre-dawn darkness, their black wetsuits and face paint making them nearly invisible against the rocky coastline. They moved like shadows across the beach, using natural cover and staying low to avoid detection. Their training had taught them to blend seamlessly with their environment, becoming one with the terrain. As the sun began to rise, the team adjusted their positions, taking advantage of the changing light and shadows. They had identified several key observation points along the beach, including rocky outcroppings, driftwood barriers, and small caves that provided excellent concealment. From these positions, they could observe the entire beach area while remaining completely hidden from view. Commander had positioned himself behind a large boulder about 50 yards from where Sarah had set up her towel, though neither he nor his team were aware of her presence initially. The SEALs were focused on their designated target areas further down the beach, where they were simulating surveillance of enemy supply routes and potential landing zones. The team's communication system allowed them to stay in constant contact through nearly silent hand signals and occasional whispered radio transmissions. They had been in position for over an hour, methodically documenting patterns of civilian movement, potential security threats, and environmental factors that could affect future operations. Petty Officer, scanning the area through his high-powered scope, was the first to notice the situation developing between Sarah and. Initially, he thought it might be a domestic dispute or an argument between people who knew each other. However, his training had taught him to observe human behavior carefully, and something about the body language he was seeing through his scope triggered his instincts. "Commander, we have a potential situation developing at bearing 270, whispered into his radio, using the team's designated frequency. "Adult male approaching lone female, behavior appears aggressive." Immediately shifted his position to get a better view of what had spotted. Through his own binoculars, he could see approaching Sarah's position. The woman's body language clearly indicated discomfort and fear, while the man's posture suggested predatory intent. "Continue observation," replied quietly. "Document but do not engage unless situation escalates to immediate threat." The SEAL team was trained to maintain operational security during training exercises, which meant avoiding unnecessary contact with civilians. However, they were also sworn to protect American citizens, and knew that if the situation became dangerous, his duty to protect would override mission protocols. As the team watched through their scopes and binoculars, they could see increasingly aggressive behavior. When he grabbed Sarah's wrist and began pulling her toward the isolated area behind the rocks, the situation changed dramatically. This was no longer a training exercise concern. It was a real-world threat to an innocent civilian. "Sir, target has made physical contact with the female," reported from his position. "She appears to be in distress and trying to escape. Target is moving her toward concealment behind the rock formation." Felt his jaw clench as he watched actions escalate. The commander had a 16-year-old daughter back home in Virginia, and the sight of any man threatening a woman triggered both his protective instincts and his professional training. However, he also knew that premature action could potentially make the situation worse for the victim. "Team, prepare for possible intervention," ordered quietly. And Foster moved to flanking positions, maintain overwatch, ready the distraction devices, Williams, and prepare for rapid deployment. The SEALs began moving into position with the silent efficiency that had made them legends among special operations forces. They spread out in a coordinated pattern that would allow them to surround completely while providing multiple angles of approach and escape routes for the victim. Each team member understood their role instinctively. They had trained for scenarios like this countless times, though usually in the context of hostage rescues or combat situations. The principles remained the same: isolate the threat, protect the innocent, and neutralize the danger with minimal risk to bystanders. Through their scopes, they could see hand rising toward Sarah's face. The aggressive posture and threatening gesture left no doubt about his intentions, made the split-second decision that would change everyone's morning dramatically. "All units, we have escalation to imminent physical assault," said into his radio. "Authorization granted for intervention. Execute on my command." The 6 Navy SEALs moved into action with the precision and coordination that years of training had burned into their muscle memory. They approached from multiple angles, using the terrain and available cover to remain undetected until the last possible moment. Their goal was to create an overwhelming show of force that would instantly de-escalate the situation while ensuring the safety of the victim. As hand continued its arc toward Sarah's face, the SEALs prepared to announce their presence. They had positioned themselves to create a complete tactical advantage, with clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes secured. The morning training exercise was about to become a real-world rescue operation. The irony was not lost on Commander that their training in beach reconnaissance and stealth infiltration had put them in the perfect position to help an innocent woman in danger. Sometimes, he thought, the best training exercises were the ones that reminded you why you wore the uniform in the first place. The word "halt" exploded across the quiet beach with the unmistakable authority of military command. Hand froze in mid-swing, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process what was happening. The voice had come from directly behind him, close enough that he could feel the speaker's presence, though he had heard no footsteps approaching. Sarah's eyes flew open in shock and relief. One moment she had been bracing for a violent blow, and the next she heard the most beautiful word in the English language shouted with such force and conviction that even her attacker had stopped dead in his tracks. Slowly turned around, his grip still tight on Sarah's wrist, and found himself staring at 6 of the most intimidating men he had ever seen. They had appeared as if from nowhere, moving with the silent efficiency of predators. Each man was in peak physical condition, their faces painted with camouflage, their eyes cold and focused with the intensity that only came from years of life-or-death training. Commander stood directly behind, close enough to reach out and touch him. The other 5 SEALs had positioned themselves in a perfect tactical formation, creating a semicircle that left with no escape routes. They stood motionless, like coiled springs ready to explode into action at the slightest provocation. "Release the woman immediately," commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Step away from her and keep your hands visible." His alcohol-addled brain tried to make sense of the situation. These men had appeared out of nowhere like ghosts, and their professional bearing and coordinated positioning left no doubt that they were military. The face paint and tactical positioning suggested special forces, which meant he was facing some of the most dangerous men on Earth. "Who the hell are you?" slurred, trying to maintain his aggressive posture despite the obvious shift in power dynamics. "This is none of your business. The lady and I are just having a conversation." Petty officer, positioned to his left, spoke up with deadly calm. "Sir, I would strongly recommend you follow the commander's instructions. Release the woman now." Looked around at the circle of warriors surrounding him and finally began to understand the gravity of his situation. These weren't beach patrol officers or local security guards. These were elite special operations forces, and they had clearly been watching his every move. The coordination of their approach and their silent insertion suggested capabilities far beyond anything he had ever encountered. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding," said, his bravado beginning to crumble. "The lady and I were just talking and things got a little heated. No harm, no foul, right?" Sarah took this opportunity to speak up, her voice shaking but determined. "He grabbed me and wouldn't let me leave," she said to the SEALs. "He was threatening me and trying to drag me behind those rocks. I've never seen him before in my life." Sighs never left his face as he processed Sarah's statement. "Sir, you have 3 seconds to release that woman's wrist, or we will release it for you. I guarantee you won't enjoy our method." The threat was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that even alcohol-impaired judgment recognized the danger he was in. These men weren't making idle threats. They were stating facts about what would happen if he didn't comply immediately. Finally released Sarah's wrist, and she immediately stepped away from him, moving toward the safety of the SEALs' formation. Hospital Corpsman Williams positioned himself protectively between Sarah and while the others maintained their tactical positions. "That's better," said. "Now, slowly reach into your back pocket and remove your identification. Use only 2 fingers and move very slowly." His hands shaking slightly as he produced his wallet, moved forward and took the identification, reading the name aloud for the team. Age 34, local address. Nodded and continued his assessment of the situation. "Mister, you have just committed assault and attempted kidnapping in front of 6 witnesses who happen to be federal law enforcement officers. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right." His face went pale as the full implications of his actions began to sink in. Not only had he been caught in the act by military personnel, but they had just identified themselves as federal officers, which meant his charges would likely be prosecuted at the federal level rather than in local court. "Now listen carefully," continued. "You are going to sit down on the sand right where you are, place your hands on top of your head, and remain completely still while we sort this situation out. Any movement other than breathing will be considered a threat to the safety of this woman and my team." Sat down heavily in the sand, his hands clasped behind his head. The fight had gone out of him completely as the reality of facing potential federal charges began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged brain. He had gone from feeling powerful and in control to being completely helpless in a matter of seconds. Sarah was shaking, partly from the adrenaline of her narrow escape and partly from relief. "Thank you," she said too. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." "You're safe now, ma'am," replied. "Corpsman Williams is going to check you for injuries while we secure the scene. Are you hurt anywhere?" Sarah looked down at her wrist, which was already beginning to show bruises where it grabbed her. "My wrist hurts, but I think I'm okay otherwise." Williams approached with his medical kit and began examining Sarah's wrist. "Looks like some bruising and possible soft tissue damage, but nothing appears to be broken," he reported. "We should get some ice on this and document the injuries for evidence." Meanwhile, Foster had moved to a position where he could keep watch on the surrounding area while maintained security on. Continued to scan the beach through his scope, ensuring that no other threats were approaching and that the incident wasn't attracting unwanted attention. Was already on his radio, contacting base to report the situation and request that local law enforcement respond to take into custody. "Base, this is Bravo Team. We have a Code 7 situation at grid reference 247-156. Request immediate law enforcement response for 1 adult male in custody on assault charges." Knelt down beside, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. "Mister, in about 10 minutes, local police are going to arrive to take you into custody. Until then, you belong to us. I want you to think very carefully about whether you want to make this situation any worse for yourself." Nodded weakly, all traces of his earlier aggression completely gone. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment, and he was beginning to understand that his morning drinking session had just ruined his life. The SEALs maintained their positions with the patience and professionalism that marked them as elite warriors. They had transformed a potential tragedy into a controlled situation in a matter of seconds, using their training and tactical expertise to protect an innocent civilian and apprehend a dangerous criminal. As they waited for local law enforcement to arrive, couldn't help but reflect on how their training exercise had turned into a real-world rescue mission. Sometimes the best military operations were the ones that reminded you why you served your country in the first place. The arrival of the Oceanside Police Department marked the beginning of what would become one of the most thoroughly documented assault cases in the city's history. Detective Maria Santos had been dispatched to what she initially thought would be a routine beach disturbance call. But when she saw 6 Navy SEALs standing in perfect formation around a suspect, she knew this was far from ordinary. Detective Santos stepped out of her patrol car and immediately assessed the scene. The military personnel were clearly in control of the situation, their professional bearing and tactical positioning indicating they had handled everything by the book. The suspect sat motionless in the sand with his hands behind his head, while a woman stood nearby receiving medical attention from one of the SEALs. "Good morning, I'm Detective Santos," she announced as she approached Commander. "I understand we have an assault situation here." Saluted respectfully and replied, "Yes, ma'am. Lieutenant Commander Jake, SEAL Team 7. We witnessed an assault in progress and intervened to protect the victim. The suspect is, and we have maintained custody since the incident occurred approximately 20 minutes ago." Detective Santos was impressed by the professionalism and precision of his report. In her 15 years as a police officer, she had rarely seen such a well-controlled scene. "I'll need to get statements from everyone involved," she said. "Can you give me a preliminary summary of what occurred?" Gestured toward Sarah, who was still being treated by Corpsman Williams. "My team was conducting training exercises in the area when we observed the suspect approach the victim aggressively. We witnessed him grab her wrist forcibly and begin dragging her toward an isolated area while making threats. When he raised his hand to strike her, we intervened." "How many witnesses do we have?" Santos asked, already knowing that having 6 trained military observers would make this case incredibly solid from an evidentiary standpoint. "6 members of my team observed the entire incident, ma'am," replied. "We maintained visual contact from the initial approach through the intervention. Additionally, we have the victim's statement and the suspect's identification." Detective Santos walked over to where sat in the sand. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow look of someone who had just realized how dramatically his life was about to change. The smell of alcohol was still strong on his breath, and his disheveled appearance suggested he had been drinking for some time. "Mister, I'm Detective Santos. You're under arrest for assault and attempted kidnapping. Do you understand these charges?" Santos read his Miranda rights while Petty Officer Foster documented the process with his camera. Nodded weakly but said nothing. His lawyer instincts, what few remained through his alcohol haze, told him that anything he said would only make his situation worse. The presence of 6 highly trained military witnesses made any denial of the charges pointless. Meanwhile, Detective Santos interviewed Sarah, who provided a detailed account of the incident. "I was just trying to read and enjoy the beach," Sarah explained, her voice still shaky from the experience. "He approached me and became aggressive when I asked him to leave me alone. When I tried to leave, he grabbed my wrist and wouldn't let go. He was dragging me toward those rocks and raised his hand to hit me when those brave men shouted, 'Halt.'" Hospital Corpsman Williams had documented Sarah's injuries thoroughly, photographing the bruising on her wrist and taking detailed notes about her physical and emotional condition. "The victim has sustained bruising consistent with forcible restraint," he reported to Detective Santos. "No other physical injuries apparent, but she's experiencing symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction." Detective Santos turned to, who had been maintaining overwatch during the incident. "Petty Officer, can you describe what you observed through your scope?" Provided a detailed timeline of events, his military training making him an exceptionally reliable witness. The suspect approached the victim's position at approximately 8:47 hours. Initial contact appeared friendly, but his body language quickly became aggressive when the victim attempted to dismiss him. At 8:49, he made physical contact by grasping her wrist. By 8:51, he was forcibly moving her toward concealment while the victim clearly resisted. Each member of the SEAL team provided similar detailed accounts, their training in observation and documentation making them ideal witnesses. Detective Santos realized that this was going to be one of the strongest assault cases she had ever worked on. The coordinated testimony of 6 elite military personnel, combined with photographic evidence and the victim's statement, would make conviction almost certain. As was loaded into the patrol car, Detective Santos spoke with Commander about the timeline for testimony and evidence submission. "Commander, I'll need your team to provide written statements within the next few days. Given your training status, will you be available for court proceedings if this goes to trial?" Nodded. "Absolutely, Detective. My team and I will make ourselves available for any legal proceedings. This incident occurred during our official training exercise, so our testimony is part of our military duty. Detective Santos also spoke with Sarah about victim services and the legal process ahead. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that with these witnesses and the evidence we've collected, this is an extremely strong case. Mr. will likely face significant charges, possibly including federal charges since this occurred in the presence of federal officers. Sarah was still processing everything that had happened. I keep thinking about what would have occurred if these men hadn't been there, she said. That man was going to hurt me, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. Corpsman Williams, who had seen combat stress reactions in various forms, recognized that Sarah would benefit from professional counseling. Ma'am, what you experienced today was traumatic, and it's completely normal to have strong emotional reactions. I'd recommend speaking with a counselor who specializes in assault cases. Detective Santos provided Sarah with contact information for victim services and assured her that the district attorney's office would be in touch soon. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that you did nothing wrong today. You were the victim of an unprovoked assault, and thanks to these, justice will be served. As the police car drove away within custody, Commander gathered his team for a brief after-action review. What started as a training exercise became a real-world operation. Your professionalism and tactical execution were flawless. You protected an innocent civilian and ensured that a dangerous individual was removed from the streets. Spoke for the team when he said, "Sir, this is exactly why we train the way we do. When civilians need protection, we need to be ready to act immediately and effectively." The incident would later be used as a case study in military training programs, demonstrating how Special Operations Forces could seamlessly transition from training exercises to real-world crisis response. The SEAL team's intervention had not only saved Sarah from potential serious harm, but it also provided law enforcement with an airtight case against a repeat offender. Detective Santos later learned that had a history of similar incidents, though previous victims had been reluctant to press charges or had lacked sufficient evidence for prosecution. The detailed documentation and credible witnesses from this incident would finally put him behind bars where he could no longer threaten innocent women. The morning that had started as a routine training exercise had become a powerful reminder that military training serves a higher purpose than just combat readiness. Sometimes the most important missions are the ones that protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. 3 months later, the courtroom was packed as trial reached its conclusion. District Attorney had prosecuted hundreds of assault cases during her career, but rarely had she worked with such overwhelming evidence and credible witnesses. The case had become a landmark example of how military training and civilian protection could intersect with the justice system. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row of the courtroom, flanked by Victim Services advocate Jennifer. Over the past 3 months, Sarah had counseling to deal with the trauma of the assault, but she had also found strength in knowing that her attacker would face justice. The support she had received from the SEAL team and law enforcement had helped her transform from victim to survivor. Commander and his team sat in the witness section, wearing their dress uniforms for their court appearance. Their testimony over the previous 2 days had been devastating to the defense. Each SEAL had provided detailed, consistent accounts of the incident, their military training making them exceptionally credible witnesses. The defense attorney had been unable to shake their testimony despite aggressive cross-examination. Sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the aggressive man who had terrorized Sarah on the beach. 3 months in county jail awaiting trial had sobered him up and given him time to contemplate the gravity of his actions. His public defender had advised him to accept a plea bargain, but had insisted on going to trial, apparently believing he could somehow convince a jury that 6 Navy SEALs had misunderstood what they witnessed. The prosecution had methodically built their case over 3 days. Detective Santos had about the evidence collection and the suspect's arrest. Hospital Corpsman Williams had presented medical testimony about Sarah's injuries and the psychological impact of the assault. Each member of the SEAL team had provided detailed testimony about their observations and intervention. District Attorney rose for her closing argument, addressing the jury with the confidence of someone who knew she had an airtight case. Ladies, and of the jury, over the past 3 days, you have heard testimony from 6 highly trained military observers who witnessed the defendant's assault on Ms. Martinez. These are not casual bystanders who glimpsed something in passing. These are elite special operations forces whose job requires them to observe, analyze, and act on what they see with split-second accuracy. She continued, the defendant grabbed Ms. Martinez against her will, causing physical injury that was documented and photographed. He dragged her toward an isolated area while she resisted and called for help. When she tried to escape, he raised his hand to strike her. These are not the actions of someone engaging in casual conversation, as the defense has suggested. These are the actions of a predator who was stopped only by the intervention of these brave. The defense attorney, Mark Harrison, made a valiant effort in his closing argument, but had little to work with given the overwhelming evidence. My client admits that he may have had too much to drink that morning and that his behavior was inappropriate. However, the prosecution has failed to prove intent to commit kidnapping, and the assault charge is based on what might have happened rather than what actually occurred. The jury retired to deliberate, but their decision came quickly. After just 2 hours, they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges: assault, attempted kidnapping, and public intoxication. The foreman read the verdict in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. Judge thanked the jury for their service before turning to address. Mister, you have been found guilty of serious crimes that could have resulted in devastating harm to an innocent woman. The only reason we're not dealing with more serious charges today is because of the intervention of 6 courageous who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The judge continued, I have reviewed your criminal history, and this is not your first offense involving the harassment of women. The court sees a pattern of predatory behavior that must be addressed severely to protect the community. Was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 3 years. Additionally, he was ordered to undergo mandatory counseling for alcohol abuse and anger management, and he would be required to register as a convicted violent offender upon his release. After the sentencing, Sarah Martinez stood outside the courthouse with Commander and his team. She had wanted to thank them publicly for their intervention and their willingness to testify. I don't think I'll ever be able to fully express what you men did for me that day, she said, her voice steady and strong. You saved me from something terrible, and then you followed through to make sure justice was served. Replied on behalf of his team, Ma'am, we were just doing our job. Protecting innocent Americans is exactly why we wear this uniform, whether it's overseas or right here at home. Petty Officer added, We're just glad we were there at the right time. Our training taught us to observe and act, and we're honored that we could help prevent a terrible situation from getting worse. The case had garnered significant media attention, not just because of the dramatic nature of the rescue, but because it highlighted the dedication and professionalism of America's Special Operations Forces. Local news stations had covered the story extensively, and it had been picked up by national media as an example of military personnel going above and beyond their duty to protect civilians. Detective Santos, who had been promoted to sergeant partly based on her exemplary handling of the case, reflected on how the incident had impacted everyone involved. This case showed me the best of what happens when highly trained professionals work together to protect innocent people. From the initial intervention by the SEALs to the prosecution by the DA's office, everyone involved made sure that justice was served. Sarah had used her experience as motivation to become involved in victim advocacy. She began volunteering with organizations that help assault survivors navigate the legal system and find counseling resources. What happened to me was terrible, she said in an interview with a local newspaper, but seeing how the system worked to protect me and punish my attacker has given me hope. I want other victims to know that justice is possible. The SEAL team returned to their training and eventual deployment, but the incident had reinforced their understanding of why their skills were important beyond combat operations. Their ability to observe, analyze, and act decisively had prevented a serious crime and ensured that a dangerous predator was removed from the community. Commander later incorporated the incident into training scenarios for other special operations units. This case demonstrates that our training has applications beyond the battlefield, he would tell new recruits. The skills we develop to protect our nation abroad can also be used to protect innocent civilians right here at home. The beach where the incident occurred became a symbol of how ordinary places can become scenes of both danger and heroism. The Oceanside Police Department increased patrols in the area, and local businesses posted information about beach safety and how to report suspicious behavior. 5 years later, when was released from prison, he found a community that had not forgotten his crimes. His registration as a violent offender limited his housing and employment options, and he was required to attend regular counseling sessions. The consequences of that morning on the beach would follow him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Sarah had completed her nursing degree and was working at a trauma center, where her experience as a survivor helped her connect with patients who had endured similar ordeals. She remained in contact with some of the SEALs who had saved her, and they had become lifelong friends united by the experience they had shared. The case had demonstrated that heroism could appear in the most unexpected places and times. 6 men conducting a routine training exercise had become guardian angels for a woman they had never met. Their willingness to act decisively in a moment of crisis had changed multiple lives and served as a powerful reminder that those who serve in the military do so to protect all Americans, whether at home or abroad. The story became part of the lore of SEAL Team 7, passed down to new members as an example of the team's motto that they were always ready to serve and protect, regardless of the circumstances. It served as proof that their training and dedication extended far beyond military operations to include the fundamental duty of protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm.